Yes, Michael, you should start, definitely.
Would you mind texting him, Albert? And
Yeah, so don't worry. Okay, just you can start.
Okay.
Okay, well, we have a very interesting topic that began with Prime Minister Keating's speech on the issue of the day, the issue of the hour, the defence of democratic Taiwan being in Australia's interest or not. Mr. Keating was very literal and said we didn't have a peace treaty with Taiwan or any piece of paper that said we should defend them, and it was not in our national interests. His views were subsequently probably more subtly dealt with by the leading realist, so-called academic Hugh White, who said that we had to sacrifice the good democracy in Taiwan for peace in our region, and that we had to quite bluntly make that decision. John, what's the nature of the threat we're facing from China? What's the nature of the regime? And what does it mean that China will resume control over this so-called province of China? Do they really believe that? Does taking it over mean blockading it, invading it? What are the wider implications for the rest of us?
Oh, no, Mike.
You've got to unmute yourself.
I have unmuted.
Good.
There we go.
Thank you, Michael. Basically, the government in Beijing is an aggrieved and resentful state for a number of reasons. It carries the load of what it regards as unfinished business from the Civil War and the revolutionary period. And part of that is what it calls its original mission, or its original intentions and its historical mission, which include recovering Taiwan. Now, that's not the only thing, of course. I think what we need to bear in mind here, that whatever the historical merits of the case of the unification with Taiwan, the party's original intention, as Xi Jinping has been reminding us, is basically to uphold faith in Marxism, Leninism, and the whole sort of catechism of Leninist doctrine, and basically realize victory for socialism and communism and the end of democracy and private capital. I mean, we need to take this quite seriously. He says this kind of thing. The Communist Party claims that it is a communist party. It has renewed confidence. He calls it self-confidences. There's this expression, the 4 self-confidences, which he's announced, and they really indicate the Communist Party's intent to return to its original vision and achieve its historical mission, which includes reunification with Taiwan. It goes beyond that, as I said, as he pointed out himself at the first meeting of the Politburo after his appointment in 2012, and I'll just quote in English: "The party is engaged in a long-term struggle between 2 social systems. It must build a socialism superior to capitalism and lay the foundation for a future where it wins the initiative and has the dominant position." Now, that's not just about socialism or Marxism or Leninism, about China as a Leninist state, and with a streak of sort of romantic nationalism, which borders on fascism at the present time. We can't set that aside and say, well, Taiwan's part of China, let's reunify, it should be reunified with China, whatever we think of that claim. And there are historical grounds for that, of course, which we could debate if we wish. But it comes down to the nature of the regime. This is a regime that is intent on basically changing the order in the region and realizing its original vision at the time of the revolution when it failed to capture.
John, most Australians can't believe in all of this communist mumbo jumbo. They think a communist is some woolly-headed green like Lee Rhiannon. What's the reality?
Well, of course, we had 30 years of opening and reform, where a very real reform element within the Chinese leadership sought to make amends for the terrible errors of the Maoist era. That's all come to an end. I mean, Xi Jinping came in to put an end to reform and reinstate, in many ways, the early vision of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. And whatever Australians may think, if one reads what he says and takes it seriously, then we have a real challenge here, not just over Taiwan, not just over China as a state, but of a regime which is, tending towards a kind of romantic fascism in the way nationalism is merging with Leninism in the present time, with territorial claims supported by confidence, self-confidence, as he calls it, in realizing the original vision of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a pretty potent combination. And so Taiwan, of course, is front of mind at present, but the issue is much bigger than that.
Can I turn to our distinguished poet in residence at former intelligence analyst, great writer and columnist for newspapers. You seem to have the same combination that James Jesus Angleton had, Paul.
I'd like to think that the difference is I'm not paranoid, apart from the fact that I don't.
And you haven't arrested any Soviet defectors and hidden them in a bank vault. Very good. Is it all over if Beijing moves on Taiwan?
Well, of course, that's what Greg Sheridan argued in the Weekend Australian, that if the Chinese take Taiwan, if the US can't stop them taking Taiwan, then China becomes the dominant power in the world and controls the Pacific. I think that's a gross overstatement. But I think that the word needs to be put out there concertedly and very clearly in Beijing's hearing, that if it insists on taking Taiwan by force, in subordinating Taiwan to its rule, that the territorial control of that island is only the beginning of the picture, that it will then face growing and concerted opposition from all the primary states in the region. Far from them fading away and saying, oh, we must cat out, everybody else will be saying China's a serious problem and it's unregenerate, it's aggressive, and it must be constrained. Whereas for the last 30, 40 years, we've been saying, let China in. Relax, indulge it, don't be hypercritical, draw it into the trading system. I've just been asked to review a new book that's coming out next year by Aaron Friedberg called Getting China Wrong, in which he's arguing that our policy settings, and specifically US policy settings regarding China, have been fundamentally in error for a long time, and that it's taken a long time to wake up to what the party was doing. I think there's considerable truth in what John said a moment ago, which is that until Xi Jinping took over, there was at least ambivalence as to the general direction of the party. But even if you allow that, there's no ambivalence about Xi Jinping. But one way to encapsulate the significance of Taiwan, it seems to me, without getting the analogy out of perspective, is that if Taiwan fell, whether by default or in a war, far from that being the end, that would be the beginning of a very serious and prolonged confrontation with China. It would be roughly the equivalent, it seems to me, of Nazi Germany taking over Czechoslovakia in 1938. And we all know that in 1938, there were various people, the Hugh Whites of the day, saying it's a little country far away, it should be sacrificed in the interest of peace and general order. Well, it was sacrificed, and far from leading to peace and stability, it destabilized the continent, for the very good reason that Czechoslovakia could have robustly defended itself and had security guarantees from other great powers. Taiwan has those security guarantees, and it does have a credible defense, but it doesn't have the kind of defense which, left on its own, could long withstand the overwhelming power of a contemporary PLA. So what we need is to deter China from attacking rather than count on defeating it in an all-out war over Taiwan. And one of the ways to pitch this to Beijing is to say, not simply quietly behind closed doors, but that it makes no sense for the party to threaten Taiwan in this way. Taiwan is clearly an integral part of the broader Chinese world. It's invested massively in the mainland. There are a large number of Taiwanese who live and work on the mainland, have been for many years. Taiwan's the center of microchip production. They speak the same language. They're never going away geographically. The idea that they're any kind of threat to China and that threatening them as a way to bring them closer to Beijing is madness. And instead of pandering to the party's grievances, to use John's expression about the Civil War, we should be saying, let the Civil War go. Think of the future. Think of the good of the Chinese people and of the prospects for a tractable China in a global world, instead of this ideological nonsense. And we should be calling out on ideological grounds exactly what Xi Jinping is doing and how retrograde it is, how reactionary it is. And I would add one more thing, not to want to monopolize discussion, and that is this, that we should also be emphasizing very publicly that it was not the Communist Party that lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. The growth that's occurred over the last 30, 40 years in China was overwhelmingly from the private sector, unleashed from Maoism. And what Xi Jinping is now doing is seeking to control that, interfere with that, rein it in, as if he believes, or as if it was the case, that the party was responsible for prosperity in China. The party has battened on prosperity in China. And to the extent that it now insists on infiltrating, controlling, or containing the private sector, it's going to hamper its prospects for ongoing prosperity. We should be spelling all this out, making clear that these are on the wrong tram altogether, and that for the good of China as well as the rest of us, that needs to change.
Peter Khalil, our distinguished member for Wills, the former National Security Advisor to Kevin Rudd. You should get a medal just for that. And very capable think tanker in Washington, various think tanks. If you listen carefully, Peter, to the special that Sky News ran on China's new aggressive stance, it was laced with advice from Beijing's most vociferous tribune, Bob Carr. And one of the pieces of advice he had, if you listen carefully, was that China had the right to resume Taiwan so that it could access, its submarine fleet could access the Northern Marianas Trench. And that was important because then that would give them the right to a second strike attack on the United States. Now, that is a macabre, overblown rhetoric from Bob Carr. But what's your reaction to these increasing moves against Taiwan? And do you think Paul's being too pessimistic to say that that we'll fight on even if Taiwan is defeated?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Albert, for the invitation. And I mean, you've got a couple of questions in there, Michael, starting very much with the former leaders, if I could use that word, with respect to Bob Carr. But so you started with Paul Keating, and he's mentioned of the piece of paper, that there is no piece of paper tying us in some sort of alliance with Taiwan. I just wanted to make the point, though, that there are much stronger bonds than a piece of paper or some sort of agreement. Then they are the bonds of democracy, freedom, values that we share. And frankly, we are looking at one of the biggest decisions probably of the 21st century. This is going to be a big choice, the choice of the 21st century about whether we and other allies stand strong with Taiwan if there is an attempt of forced reunification, if there is an attempt at a full-scale invasion, and if there is conflict. Now, the question, though, is that inevitable? And that was the question of this panel. And I would say nothing is inevitable in politics, foreign affairs, or life. We all know that. I'm not so deterministic in that sense. Good diplomacy backed by very strong defence capability can change the course of events. And indeed, I think it's probably true to say, although it should be happening a little bit quicker, that we and many of our allies are starting to move more in sync. As Paul noted, the importance of actually advocating publicly and very openly about why this would be not in China's long-term interests in a diplomatic sense, but also shoring up our defence capabilities. And I know the US is starting to do that in a slow kind of shift turning the ship of state, to excuse the pun, on this. But there are other things that we can point to. Xi Jinping is 68 years old. Yes, he's reasonably fit. He's a little bit overweight, hence the Winnie the Pooh kind of teasing. But, it is his legacy that is tied to this. The rise of his cult of personality, the inextricable link with Xi and his leadership and the CCP, and their main raison d'etre, at least what he pushes forward, as Paul said, in that reactionary sense, is the need for this reunification to justify his leadership and the CCP's existence. These are very strong forces, motivations towards that. And the things that the known unknowns, we don't know whether the overreach by Xi, that centralisation of power, has led to certain elements within the CCP working to try and resist that. If we were to know that, they certainly wouldn't be doing what they're doing, because Xi would know about it and his people would know about it. So there are known unknowns. How much resistance is there within the CCP? Is it those people within there who understand the argument that Paul just made about the economic suicide of a full-scale invasion to China's long-term interests? Paul mentioned the semiconductors and the integrated circuits, which Taiwan is one of the leading producers of, and which are the main inputs into much of China's manufacturing in this space. So there is that economic suicide argument. And then the other point I wanted to make was the PLA. Will they be ready? Paul, you talked about the PLA being a very potent force, but there are question marks around the efficacy of the troops and their capability and their ability, frankly. You hear stories, anecdotal, of course, about Chinese troops, young men crying as they're being sent, there's a video apparently circulating of them crying tears because they're being sent to the front line in the Himalayas. What's the morale like? What's the kind of the resilience of those troops? And then the question really around when they will be ready, when the PLA generals will be able to say to Xi, we are ready to go. And there's lots of modelling around that. The Pentagon's made some assessments. Some other experts have said, 2 to 3 years before the PLA might, the next aircraft carrier that come online, they might be being able to go to the president around the time when he's 71 to say, we're ready to go. We think we can do this. And he's got to make that choice. And then the big question is when for him? Is it the party Congress next year? Is it the US election where there's a certain weak spot, I suppose, in the collective stance of the West when there's a transition in the US administrations potentially? Or is it the anniversary of the party in 2027? And the last point I want to make in relation to the defence side of things, and this goes to Australia, I kind of, to give Peter Dutton some benefit of the doubt, he might be trying to build up some resilience in the Australian populace, but I would have thought, probably follow, to paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and walk with a big stick, because the government is talking a big game on defending Taiwan and talking about those issues. My question to Peter Dunn is, what with? You've left us with a defence capability gap for the next 25 years. The AUKUS deal is good in its context as a defence acquisition decision, but it's 25 years away. What have we got from now until then? So that's a really important point. I think we need to be really circumspect about how we can support our allies and Taiwan in case of a conflict. And I think the main thing, actually, is to do everything we can, in line again with what Paul was saying earlier, to make that diplomatic case that this would not be in anyone's interest, including the CCP and China, to go down this path, that there is another path forward. That might be impossible. We might not reach that objective, but we must try and do everything we can to prevent conflict in the next couple of years. And I think it's possible. Nothing is inevitable, but it's our responsibility. And we're talking about one of the most significant tectonic plate shifts in geostrategic terms for this century. And what happens will be definitive for Australia's prosperity, our stability, the whole region, and our security for decades to come. And we've got to get this right.
We don't know the effect that an attack on Taiwan's particularly successful attack would have on Japan or South Korea. So, that's a phenomena that we really have to be concerned about too. If there was successful attack, or less likely an attack. I think the most likely thing is the Chinese to do something halfway in between like a blockade. But what would Australia do, Senator Kitching? You're on the very well-publicised Interparliamentary Alliance on China. We can't just talk human rights to deter them. What is the obverse of Paul Keating's question? Why is it in Australia's interest to defend Taiwan?
Well, and I will just say that Belgium has just this evening joined the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics. So that's yet another democracy joining that boycott. Look, you know, Paul Keating was a great treasurer and Prime Minister, but he is entirely wrong on Hong Kong. I mean, to diminish Taiwan in the way that he did, to call them China's front doorstep. It was fundamentally a civil matter for China, which is exactly the CCP's language. The CCP says that it's an internal matter. I think, for Australia to have another democracy, another like democracy in our region is really important. And I think there are many things that we can do. Peter and I, as elected representatives, we meet with Taiwanese representatives, with TACO, the Taiwanese Economic and Cultural Office. I mean, we have advocated that, my view is that Taiwan should be a full member of the World Health Assembly. Taiwan has been one of the most successful countries in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. They should be a member of the CCTPP. I mean, that is a trading agreement that is going to really dictate the terms of trade in our region. Now, both China and Taiwan want to join that, but I think Australia, as a founding member of the CCTPP, has a veto power, and I think we should think very carefully about China and Taiwan and who we want in there in terms of who's been a good trading partner with us.
Kimberly, is that the follow-on to the TPP that
yes.
President Trump torpedoed?
Unfortunately, I think one of the worst probably decisions of that presidency, and I think that this is a reboot. And I think what we know is that Taiwan has been a really good trading partner and has followed the norms, has followed the rules of the WTO, follows trading norms, does not do what China has just done recently, which was to essentially refuse any Lithuanian goods, because Lithuania now has a Taiwanese office in their country. They essentially have stopped Lithuanian goods being traded in China. And I think so you look at that and you look at how they've behaved in terms of trade, and you look at Taiwan and how they've behaved in terms of trade. And I think that is a very important decision that Australia will make as a founding member of the CCTPP.
But Kimberly, that recently at the conference on democracies, Beijing went crazy about Taiwan having a different coloured map than them. What are they going to do if you advocate them joining the TPP? Well, might it not be a way of jiu-jitsuing them by saying that their admission to the CTPPP would be conditional upon them allowing the Taiwanese to join as well? Do you think they could swallow it in that form? They wouldn't swallow it in that form.
I'd be pessimistic about that. And I think the reason that they've now shown interest is because they know Taiwan is being considered. So it's a sort of I'm not sure that was a mature decision that was being made in Beijing.
Is your powerful alliance of interparliamentary parliamentarians behind this idea that the Taiwanese should be allowed to join?
Actually, we're having a meeting tomorrow morning at 5 a.m.
Oh, no.
5 a.m. Australian time.
I've
Australian
sprung you.
Eastern Daylight Time. But I think, that the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, to which Michael is referring, is a an organisation of different parliamentarians and different legislatures. So there's 19 plus the European Parliament, and it's been really, it's allowed people to share views and to share what's happening in their country. So, and we've also sponsored research by Adrian Zenz, who is an anthropologist really, but has done research into Xinjiang. So I think we're going to DC in late January, and I think it's been a really good alliance of like-minded countries, and has helped smaller countries. Australia is very much admired in that group, as it is in Washington, because Australia has stood up for its values. So I think it's been
Kimberly,
important.
it's getting to the pointy end. Imagine they don't, Beijing, after the Winter Olympics and before the 22 congressional election, doesn't attack Taiwan, but starts the next incremental thing beyond all of the overflights, blockading it. To unblockade it, either the Taiwanese or the West, the Americans, UK, Australia, have to sink some Chinese ships. We would then appear, especially to our own publics, as the aggressor. What do you think of the possibility of a blockade, which I think is much more likely than an invasion?
I mean, it is possible, and obviously it's why FONOPs, why freedom of navigation exercises are so important. We need those. I mean, Australia would suffer terribly if those shipping lanes were compromised. I mean, that would be, as would Japan. This would be a serious. I notice, I note former Prime Minister Abe's comments today. That he says that an invasion of Taiwan would be suicidal. I think Japan, and I think their comments have become increasingly strong. They wouldn't be tolerating that either. We would be severely compromised ourselves. But there's also the question, I think, on principle of a democracy, a sovereign nation that's not claiming independence, but a sovereign nation being blockaded like that. And I think that we would need to use every fora, and then perhaps more than that, to convince the Chinese Communist Party that their path was very much mistaken.
John Fitzgerald, there must be people in the, at least the wider Politburo, if not in the Standing Committee, who think this policy is crazy and is jeopardising business and profits and the secure place of the Communist Party in the pantheon of the Chinese people. Don't they understand that if they blockade or attack Taiwan, countries like Australia just can't provide them with unlimited iron ore, watch out Twiggy Forrest, or the Americans can't, if they have a blockade of Taiwan, allow oil shipments just to go through to China, on which China is still very dependent. It's a two-way street, all of this. There must be wise heads in China.
I'm sure you're right. But at the leadership level, they'd be game planning every possible scenario at the present time. This is where I think the ideology thing comes in. It shouldn't be underestimated that although it may be an irrational choice, that Xi Jinping's commitment to this vision of an aggrieved nation, driven by his, as he calls it, self-confidence in the rightness of Marxist ideology, means that it's really not subject to empirical verification. At the end of the day, this is an act of faith. And this is where Mao went so terribly wrong. I mean, he won the revolution, true, to be sure, because a brilliant tactician, but then, the belief in the infallibility of his own decisions led him to make extremely irrational choices, which cost 40 to 50 million lives, some of which he clearly intended to do, but others of which he blamed his subordinates for doing. I think the risk is, with this ideological element in force, that rational calculation by the smartest game planners could be overridden by another kind of choice, the political choice that has to do with Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, Marxism, and destiny. There's a
It's worth-
strong sense of historical destiny running through Xi Jinping's thought.
That is the, sorry, Michael, to interrupt. And John's point, I think, is right. And this is what fills me with great pessimism. Well, I don't think it's inevitable. I think John is right. I think that the irrational political ideological imperative will override any rational decision making and leave that economic suicide argument that Paul eloquently put out and we all think makes a lot of sense, and put it, by the wayside. And that's the real problem. So really, I mean, I'd be interested to know from experts, and I ask this question all the time, what will tip Xi back or push him back? It has to be really, at the crux of it, a threat to his hold on power. That is probably the only thing that will prevent him from blockading or a full-scale invasion, where the cost of doing so actually is about his hold on power within the CCP. And this is why I wonder whether there are elements within the party who are resisting his attempts, although from everything I've seen, he has been extremely successful in eliminating all internal opposition, and doing it in a very, very clever way by using corruption and other allegations and so on to get rid of his internal enemies. It's the old Stalinist thing writ large, right?
No one remembers Bolshevi's name even, Peter.
No.
Well, John Garno wrote that very good book. But I think, also the Chinese people, do they tolerate, if there was an invasion, do they tolerate seeing ethnic Chinese dead in the streets?
Well,
Will they see that?
one of the things that-
You have a shot.
So, who?
You.
Oh, thanks. What springs to mind here when we talk about rationality, ideology, and calculation is again the 1930s, 1940s. I mean, it's clear that when in 1939 the Nazis overrun Poland, Hitler said to his general staff, "France is next," and they said, "Well, that's a really bad idea. If you tell us to invade France, we're going to lose because the defences are thoroughly set up. We launch a frontal assault with Maginot Line into Flanders. We're going to lose 1 million men and lose the war." And Hitler said, "Well, if you think that a frontal assault's not going to work, you better come up with another strategy because we are going to war." Now, that's what can happen in a dictatorship. We now know that the general staff then spent months at Zos and they had breathing space because the weather was bad, so there was a delay on the assault. And they came up with the plan to strike through the Ardennes and try and catch the Allies off balance. Their own calculation with that plan was that it had a 10% chance of success and it depended on human error on the other side. But they won, and then Hitler decided, "You see, I'm a genius, right?" And became more untrammeled than ever. And it seems to me that this is perhaps the kind of situation we're facing, as John and Peter have both more or less pointed out. I think for that reason, it's all the more important that the Allied powers, if we may call it that, step up the information warfare and as it were, address in a concerted way the people in China who are able to listen and those to whom it might filter through, that setting China on a collision course with everybody else might briefly stoke the fires of romantic nationalism, but it's a catastrophic course for China to take. It will lead to no good, and that everything that it's gained since the death of Mao is being put in jeopardy by this man, right? And I put this in writing myself a few months ago, and I said, he must go. We must say we cannot deal with Xi Jinping. He's going altogether the wrong way. China, welcome with open arms as China. The party, very ambivalent. Xi, no. And that then forces the issue. But if we keep soft pedaling and saying, "Oh, well, China's just being China and it's got legitimate grievances and we don't want to offend them and heaven forbid there be a war," then we're leaving it to him to make that irrational dictatorial decision, then to the peril of everybody. And I should add, in the case of
right.
in the case of Czechoslovakia in 1938, the Black Orchestra sent people to talk to the British and said, "Listen, if you stand up to Hitler, we might be able to remove him in a coup. But if you cave, our hands are tied and there'll be a continental war." But they weren't believed.
Well, you are absolutely right. But what you're talking about is a massive effort
That
by
pen down, Peter.
by allied countries in a psyops and information warfare effort that goes against decades of conditioning.
Mhm.
and a surveillance state, which is, as we all know, extremely effective at controlling every last kind of almost detail of each Chinese person's life. So it's a massive attempt. And I don't see the West and our allies being so well orchestrated and organized. I mean, we are moving, as I said in my opening remarks, in a much more in sync fashion now, slowly but surely. I also have question marks about the US and the US's ability.
I'm glad you came to that, because ominously until now, none of us have mentioned what should have been, a guarantor of Pax Americana in the world, the United States. In 1979, when China made threatening moves against Taiwan, the American President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, moved 2 US carrier battle
Not
groups.
79, 96. You're talking about, Michael, 1996, not 1979.
Sorry, 1996.
That was Jimmy Carter.
John Howard supported the Americans' move. I wish Alexander Downer was here, because he actually wobbled for a few days. It's actually a shame he's not here too, because of his strong knowledge of United States and United States power. Kimberly, do you think that after the fall of Kabul, the Americans are up to it? Would they be able to do you think Biden or the US military might deploy something short of war to support the Taiwanese? I noticed they've strengthened their air force in Guam, but is that enough?
Well, I mean, there was the comments President Biden made in October, where he said that, that America, of course, America would defend Taiwan. And then there was a little bit of backpedaling, fierce backpedaling by others in the administration. Look, this is my view. My view is that America is a great country. It is I've lived there. From when I was young, I've lived in all parts of America. It is a great country. And it's a great friend to us and a great ally. So I would think, given that there are, strong signals from the administration, and I think that, remember, both sides, for the first time really over the last few years, both sides of the aisle are unanimous in their views on China. I mean, I think President Xi has been very successful in uniting Democrats and Republicans. So kudos to him for doing that. But so there is a will there. There is a will there to do that. And in relation to interoperability, I think that has improved over the last few years. I've been to RIMPAC. You can see, as you have, Michael, you can see that interoperability. And it's more than that. There's a like-mindedness there as well. And I think that is going to stand us in good stead.
But John, what will the Chinese do if 2 American aircraft carrier battle groups, even imagine the Americans would deploy them along with a Japanese one and maybe a British one, stood on the other side of Taiwan where their aircraft would still be used? Wouldn't they still be in danger of being attacked by those supersonic sea-skimming missiles that the Chinese have? Do you think if the Americans came to the defense of Taiwan, wouldn't it be a huge blow to US prestige all around the world if one Chinese missile took out an American aircraft carrier?
I think you're asking the wrong person there, Michael. I don't know a hell of a lot about missiles that skim the water. I think Paul might be the one. Could I just go back to something we were saying a moment ago? And I think it's very, very important about Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, and information warfare. I can understand where Paul's coming from in saying that the problem is Xi Jinping. But Peter's also right in saying we really can't address that problem directly. It's not feasible to set out to undermine Xi Jinping, the man, but it is, I think, feasible to undermine the lies that Xi Jinping circulates in the name of the Communist Party and the Chinese nation. They're legendary. There are hundreds of them. And there's very little historical or any other foundation for the claims, for the century of humiliation or the and the Communist Party beat the Japanese, and the Japanese owe the Communist Party endless whatevers. It's nonsense. A systematic information, concerted information warfare campaign, to put it mildly, I think would be quite effective within China, because people in China know these things to be true. They just can't hear anybody else saying it, because Xi has silenced truth within China. And to hear a chorus of those kinds of claims outside of China would, I think, resound, quite profoundly within the country. That may not undermine Xi himself, but it does undermine the credibility of the claims the Communist Party makes to mount this ideological assault, which it's undertaking at the present time. So that's what I'd be focusing on at this stage, not targeting Xi the man, but Xi and the many lies he tells. And I think we can do that.
Don't forget his predecessor, Hu Jintao, in his address to the Australian Parliament, did say that a Chinese fleet arrived here long before European colonisers, and therefore they
named Australia and named it. That's what he said. We gave it a name. Yeah.
Michael, can I make a point about that
Please.
US issue, which is, I think, front and centre? 3 points. The first is the current US administration, the Biden administration, as Kimberly has rightly pointed out, has demonstrated a much stronger stance, I think, and encouraging in many respects. You look at Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor's recent comments, where we actually said we would not be doing the same things we had done in the past. It was an implied criticism of the Obama administration, and that they would be a lot stronger, and they've demonstrated that. And some might think that Joe Biden made a mistake by saying he would defend Taiwan because he misread his notes, but there it is. He did say it. The second point is, the real issue is what happens in the transition in 2023, 24. And if there is a Trump administration or a return to a Trump administration which is nativist and isolationist, will there be a commitment to stand firm and defend Taiwan and the democracy that is Taiwan? Now, which brings me to the third point, whether it's a Biden administration, a Trump administration, a Klobuchar administration, Buttigieg, whatever it might be, will the United States be willing to make that enormous sacrifice and commitment, A, to defend the democracy of Taiwan, B, to defend or to maintain US primacy in the region? That's a big question. And I'm not sure that, with the way that US domestic politics is and the way it's fractured, that you can maintain a long-standing conflict, if you like, in defense of Taiwan, especially if it stretches out, especially if we have a stalemate type situation or all the other variables that we might look at. Will the US run the course, stay the course, as it were, with respect to that, with the losses that will be inevitable?
And don't underestimate the sort of nativist and isolationist elements that still run very strong in America. The top rating program on Fox News is Tucker Carlson, who in an infamous editorial last Monday denounced the neoconservatives in the Biden administration, which I thought was very funny. The neoconservatives in the Biden administration for wanting to protect the border of Ukraine and democracy, saying that this was all a joke and sending them weapons, and why was this in America's national interest? We should be sending the 101st Airborne to the southern border. But those kinds of people, Senator Rand Paul, etc., have an important say. I noticed most of the American Republican senators and the other commentators on Fox News didn't agree with him, but it was very arresting to see it, because he knows his audience very well. He isn't the top rating guy for nothing. 7 million people see it. So I'm not sure there would be pressure there, either in Ukraine with the Russians, or in even with an all-out attack by the Chinese for the Americans to defend them. People might say, well, we've had enough of overseas engagements.
But Michael, I think there's always been that.
I'm being the devil's advocate, Kimberly. I hope it's not true.
There's always been that element, and there was that element before America joined in the Second World War. So I may
just jump in there with Kimberly, it's really important to remember that, in fact, in 1941, on the eve of Pearl Harbor, opinion polls showed that 80% of Americans were opposed to getting involved in the war. Pearl Harbor occurred, and that turned on its head overnight. And one of the things about placing aircraft carrier battle groups in Taiwan, whether in 1996 or now, is that it's not meant to say we're going to fight you. It's meant to say you really don't want to start a war with us, do you? Right now, in 1996, the answer in China was absolutely not, as it had been for decades. What the PLA has since been doing, with strong direction from the party, is deliberately trying to develop carrier killer missiles and other means to deter the US from positioning aircraft carriers. But that is still, as with nuclear weapons, a game of deterrence and bluff, right? It's not saying as soon as an aircraft carrier appears, we're going to hit it with one of these missiles, because that starts a war with the United States. What China very much clearly would prefer to do is to get Taiwan back without a war with the United States.
Yes.
A great deal, therefore, depends on the willingness and capacity of the US to say, you need to bear in mind that if you go down that path, you can't be sure that you can contain the damage, and it will occur on a number of fronts and it will be ongoing. That message needs to be really clear, rather than saying, we're going to position an aircraft carrier or two, and with those, we will prevail in an actual conflict with you. We're saying they simply symbolise the risk you're taking if you decide to cut loose. And the language needs to be very clear that we understand very well what you've assembled in the meantime to deter that. All that means is that the war escalates more quickly.
I respect that, and I respect
right.
Peter's identification of the stronger rhetoric of Jake Sullivan. But we've got a US president who was advised by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to keep a force of 2,500 people in Afghanistan. And instead, the Americans fled and forced the NATO people to flee too. And we left 24 million Afghan women to the mercies of those 6th century fanatics. I don't know whether we should have more faith in the Americans. I know Kimberly and Peter believe that they will do the right thing. Paul, do you or do Kimberly know whether the advice of John Grenfell, who was Trump's either national security or CIA director after the fall of Kabul, was we must rush shipments of modern fighters, sea mines and missiles to Taiwan? Have they received any real difference in armaments in the last 6 months or in the next 6 months?
I think it is coming. I mean, they've just spent $1 billion, so hopefully that buys
the Taiwanese have.
Yeah. So so that will buy you some hardware. I have been actually to a defence facility in Taiwan, so indigenous technology for missiles, but they're going to need a lot. And I think also the other thing for Taiwan, and I think they are revisiting this, is their national service. So it was 2 years, but has been reduced to 4 months, and I think they're now looking at increasing that again. But one of the questions I think that the West, that we have to ask ourselves is if Taiwan was invaded, do we have the will to take it back? Because that's a different scenario.
It's a very different scenario. It would, I think one of the things that would have to happen for what it was worth is that if it comes down to that, if the PLA is actually storming the beaches and raining bombs down on Taipei and Kaohsiung, that needs to be broadcast, telecast all around the world, like throwing it into complete highlight, and they won't be able to hide that. They can't stop that happening. And to show the horror and to beam that every which way into China itself, right? And there was lots of ways of causing the party and Xi Jinping grief other than just a straight kinetic. But an issue that I can't say I've delved into to sort out, but it's always been in my mind, is this: the PLA has not fought a real war in a very long time. It's got all this fancy kit, but it hasn't used it in an actual war. The US has been using its forces in multiple theatres for a long time, and its problem in Afghanistan was not that it didn't have the military capacity to clean up the Taliban in any given firefight. It's that it was fighting an insurgency war, and they go on and on and on, and all the other guy has to do is survive. If you're fighting a war with a conventional army, that's a very different proposition. And, my model for what could occur, but as I said, I haven't delved into this enough to be confident that it would, is that in the Yom Kippur War, Israel, surrounded by the Arab states that had larger forces, was set upon, taken by surprise. And after initially having taken back a step, it cleaned them up big time. And in the air war with the Syrian Air Force, they lost one Phantom F4 and shot down 73 Syrian MiGs. Why is that? Not because the MiG was an inferior platform, but because the command and control system used by the Syrians was so authoritarian that they were hidebound and they couldn't figure out what to do. They couldn't improvise. The Israelis were highly trained and skilled and able to improvise, and they slaughtered them. And the question, therefore, of the PLA-AF is it a rigid command and control? If it is, they could run into serious problems in a cross-strike.
And that is applicable to that command and control doctrine issue is a real live one with respect to the PLA. And the other example, of course, was the Israeli tanks that had independent command in each tank compared to some of the Egyptian tanks, which actually worked in a unit of 4. And, the lead tank gets knocked out, the other 3 just stopped. So is the PLA doctrine up to speed? But I just wanted to make a couple of quick points, especially around the framing that Paul was making and Kimberly. There are multiple scenarios. There are a lot of scenarios. But I think what's common throughout them, and I think there's a truism here about what Paul was saying about the importance, whatever the scenario is, to really put in that effort around the diplomatic information and defence deterrence. That's critically important. The idea here is to tell them that there's too high a price to go down this path, and it might include Xi thinking that it might lead to his own demise if he was to go down that path. But I will say this too, there are other variables in play here. The DPP in Taiwan look likely to win the next election in 24. They're slightly more they're not pro-independence, but slightly more pro-independence. They keep the status quo, but certainly different than the KMT. And Mr. Lai, who's the vice president, will likely take over from Ms. Tsai. And so that's a factor as well. And the last point I wanted to
take over in the DPP, Peter?
Yeah, Mr. Lai is the vice president. He's likely to be the successor to Ms. Tsai, and he's a little bit more pro-independence than she is. So you're not going to see any relief there. And the other point I would make is we've been talking a lot about historical parallels and so on. I think the better one to look at, although it's a bit different, is actually Cuba rather than just World War II. Because, and here I'll make this point about Cuba, the difference there, the big difference I see is that the willingness of the US was so clear because Cuba was right off the coast of Florida and the missiles were able to reach the US mainland. It was really right on their doorstep, right in their sort of neighborhood, as it were. I guarantee you the politics of this will see a unity ticket between the lefties on the MSNBC and Tucker Carlson and the Fox and Friends people who are nativists in isolation saying, what the hell has Taiwan got to do with us? Why are we even sending our boys and girls there? Why are we losing aircraft carrier? Why are we going to, commit troops there? It was always Chinese. It's Chinese. That is going to be the political narrative, as crude as I put it, but it will be a unity ticket between what is the left, progressive so-called left in the US, and parts of the right who say, nothing to do with us. We're not getting back into this war. Why should we even commit? Let's look at our own national interests, and Taiwan is on the other side of the world. And Americans, there'll be a lot of people in the public who are like, yeah, why are we losing troops over this and lives over this?
John Fitzgerald, what will the overseas Beijing apparatus do if there is a hot kinetic conflict? Will they do what the Soviet liners in the left did between 1939 and 41, and that is pray for the Soviet Union or the equivalent of China? What will they do? Or just keep quiet? You've got to unmute yourself. No, you're not unmuted yet.
And now, look, sorry.
There we go.
So China has a wide and dispersed influence and interference network around the world. It's partly mobilized through Chinese community newspapers and media, I should add that Australia has come a long way in the last 3 or 4 years in managing that issue. If we look at Chinese language media here at the present time, which had been in effect bought out and overrun by various news agencies based in China, that's largely been reversed in relation to traditional, that is, published media and radio. So in Australia, we're in a better position than we were some time back, and local communities have in effect reclaimed their own media. Nevertheless, social media, China's social media is remarkably effective. And of course, WeChat is based in China, and anyone in this country using it is subject to Chinese rules and regulations. Even our Prime Minister, Mr. Morrison, found that one of his messages was deleted late last year because it offended somebody in some kind of way. So he can't speak to other Australians in the Chinese language using the main social media platform, but the Chinese leadership can. So we're still disadvantaged there. So the information warfare will play a very large part. I think we could tie ourselves in knots getting caught up over the historical issues. I think we should steer clear of those. You know, there are sound grounds, in my judgment, for saying that China and Taiwan are the one political entity, one way or the other. There's an unresolved issue there. It seems to me if we get caught up in that, we'll just run down burrows from which we'll never escape. And that will pay into China's hands. Rather, I think the point is to highlight the value differences, point out the recognition of individual and human dignity in Taiwan, which is totally lacking in China, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the constitutional rule of law, the democratic systems in Taiwan, which make the difference. That's where we need to pitch our case, I think, rather than on historical grounds. And there are many people in China who would like China to be like Taiwan. We shouldn't forget that, and that should be part of our message as well. So yes, there'll be a big campaign internationally, not least here in Australia, to mobilise arguments around the likes that Keating has put forward, that it's really not our business, that it's China's anyway. Hey, there's nothing we can do about it. We should keep our noses out of this. I mean, that's not where we should be.
Maybe Kevin Rudd could use his million listeners on Weibo to put the alternative point of view. I suspect as soon as he said something, he'd be cut. But look, the hour is late, but you'll be surprised that there are people hanging on our every word, Kimberly, and they would like to ask you questions. So over to Alan Howe to get some questions for the team.
Michael, I've been hanging on to your every word now for about 30 years. I've got a question that I'd like to put to John Fitzgerald. When Xi Jinping spoke to the Australian Parliament, a joint sitting, that was only November 2014. That's just 7 years ago. Tony was Prime Minister, of course. And his words were repeated without any cynicism at all the following day. He addressed us as friends. He spoke of his love of Australia, his many visits here since 1988 when he first came. He'd been to every state. And you may remember, John, that he said, and I'm going to Tasmania tomorrow, which sort of ticks that box. And he spoke to Australia as being friends, and he sounded genuine. And I just reread the speech again this afternoon. It's a very warm speech. Now, was he lying or have things changed?
Good question. So even on that occasion, you might recall that there was some miscommunication. Do you remember following the speech, I think at the dinner, perhaps that evening, that Prime Minister Abbott said for the first time a Chinese president has committed to democracy. Now, he didn't commit to democracy. I mean, he has a way with words which, translated into English, sounds as if he's speaking our language when in fact he's not. That was never his intent. That said, I do think that Xi Jinping, had great fondness for Australia, as have many people in China up to that time. Things really started changing in 2013, pretty well as soon as he put on his general secretary hat, so to speak. And it revolved around the territorial claims that China made in the South China Sea. You remember the very first issue was the ADZ over the East China Sea. That was 2013. Mr. Abbott said something at that point. And I think Wang Yi criticised Julie Bishop at that time as well, or certainly criticised Australian foreign policy. Then in 2014, 2015 and 16, there's the so-called, China panic in Australian media, and that came under intense criticism in Chinese media. 2016, in particular, the Philippines tribunal ruling came down and Australia stood up, and then it was firmly rebuked by China. So consistently, Australia has stood up around issues to do with the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And it's really for those statements and matters of principle, really, Australia's trying to defend a post-war order that's at risk. Thinking of Taiwan, thinking of Japan, thinking of other countries in the region, thinking of our shipping lanes, thinking of what free trade really means. And Australia going in and acting in its national interest, but also to support a wider international order in the region is what got us into serious bother. I'd just like to add one thing there, though. If you think about the claims of political interference within Australia, within Chinese media, within Chinese civil society organisations, community organisations, and to some extent in the New South Wales Labor right, they were nearly all over the South China Sea as well. I mean, Sandasyari came a cropper because he made some claims to Chinese media in return for, apparently, the offer of a donation to the Labor Party about China's right to the South China Sea. Similarly, Chinese community organisations were mobilised to protest following the Philippines tribunal. And much of the commentary in Chinese community media was around the South China Sea claim. So in retrospect, I mean, while things look hunky-dory back in 2014, Xi Jinping had already set in train, the momentum that was going to lead to conflict over making claims in the South China Sea, which really triggered the whole Australian response. And that then goes to defending critical infrastructure, new legislation in 2018 around that, security and intelligence and foreign interference laws in 2018, and then the Foreign Relations Act in 2020, looking at how the federal government can manage state relations dealing with China, all triggered by those early 2013, 2014 EDZ and South China Sea initiatives on China's part. So yes, things did change. Xi changed them, not Australia.
Thanks, John. The next question is for Paul Monk. And I should admit here that Paul and I have known each other for about 60 years. And when we first met, we would have been short pants at school, and Mao had about 11 years to go.
Yes,
Paul, if China were to declare war on Taiwan, or not declare war, just attack Taiwan, would it be necessary that as a down payment on the US underwriting our security, that we would be involved? Is it that clear a test of the ANZUS Treaty?
I don't think that an attack on Taiwan in and of itself would trigger the ANZUS Treaty, but if the US was itself involved and US forces were attacked, that's a different matter. And of course, there are two considerations, as there always have been when we've got ourselves involved in US wars for decades. One is the strict interpretation of the treaty, and the other is the pragmatic interpretation of, do we want to appear to be a good ally of the United States, even if, strictly speaking, we could absent ourselves, as European powers have tended to do in a number of cases, notably in the Korean War as well, certainly the Vietnam War. So my sense is that, I mean, clearly our government is saying loud and clear, as Peter pointed out earlier. Peter Dutton has been very outspoken in saying, well, if it comes down to it, we're at war, which rings a little hollow if it turns out that we don't have the wherewithal to play an effective part in such a war. And one wants to ask, to what extent are our strategic interests served by bellicose rhetoric rather than careful, firm and consistent consultation with our allies and clear, level-headed rhetoric directed at China to say, you really don't want to go there. This is not going to be good for you, for us, for anyone. And I should add in that regard, there was a slight digression in your question, that one of the issues that needs to be put out there is regarding Taiwan, that the party perhaps may even overlook this because of its tendency to rewrite history and get everyone confused. And that is this: when the Kuomintang took over Taiwan, that triggered a rebellion in Taiwan that was put down brutally by the Kuomintang. Thousands of people were executed out of hand. Martial law was imposed for decades. 29,000 people were subsequently imprisoned and shot on political grounds, and most of that in the 1950s and 60s. And that led to the DPP building momentum slowly and relentlessly for independence as well as democracy in Taiwan. If the Chinese authorities repeat that acts and invade Taiwan and cause, as they would if they conquered it, all sorts of mayhem, the resentment in Taiwan would never come to an end. So in other words, in the name of reintegrating Taiwan into China, they would create for themselves everlasting resentment and desire for independence. And we know, if you look at the UK, you know, there are still those in Scotland and Wales who want independence. The Irish, you know, fight went on and on and on. So the authorities and anybody who's remotely wise in China need to be reminded that this would be a seriously unwise and counterproductive thing to do.
Paul, they've managed to suppress Hong Kong and Xinjiang.
They have.
Get Tibet.
They have. That's correct. But Taiwan's a special case because it's not an ethnic minority. It's basically Mandarin speaking, you know, it's ethnic Chinese, and it's very prosperous. It's not, you know, remote. It can't be called primitive. There's no case for saying that you're liberating and enhancing these people, even if that's, you know, that's tendentious in the case of Xinjiang and Tibet. It's completely indefensible in the case of Taiwan.
Well, that's your point about the information warfare is very relevant, because having travelled there over 20 years, I travelled there 20 years ago and then was there for the last election. Every person under 40 spoke English, which was a complete change from 20 years beforehand. So if there are lots of Western media there, there'll be lots of people who can tell them what's going on and how brutal Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are.
Back to Alan, I guess.
Yeah, okay, just on that, Paul, while I've got you, would the Chinese mainland, man and woman on the street, do they look at the Taiwanese, notwithstanding the different systems, as brothers and sisters?
I suppose it would depend on which part of China you're in. It's a very, very big country. So if you're in Fujian, you know, there's a very good chance that they more or less do. If you're in Shanghai, they probably do to a significant extent. But you go further inland, say you're in Wuhan or Chongqing, it's probably a different thing, except that, and this is significant, that in the era of prosperity, a significant number of Chinese traveled to Taiwan, you know, when that became possible. And more and more of them are educated, they've had access to information despite all the censorship, so they're more aware than their parents and grandparents probably were. And I would suspect that there's a very wide awareness that Taiwan is a very prosperous place. It's not some backwoods place. So there are different layers, I suppose, in answer to your question.
And Paul, there's lots of relatives, I assume.
Yeah, although that would have faded to some extent over time because of the long separation of the two. It's a bit like North and South Korea, you know, the families separated in Koreas, but it's been such a long time that there's been a gradual divergence. People grow old and die, and they're not replaced, you know, on site, so to speak. And what's clear in the case of Taiwan is that whereas a great many people fled the mainland with the Kuomintang and, in a sense, colonized Taiwan, these days, most of the population, of course, were born in Taiwan, and they identify as Taiwanese, not as Chinese. They don't think of it as exiles from the mainland. Taiwan's their home, their country.
Thanks, Paul. Peter Khalil, you're a man of a great judgment. If that picture behind you is of the 1990 grand final,
yeah, it is.
It looks like
Peter Dacos and Darren Millay. Well done, Alan.
I spoke to Peter Dacos earlier today. He's a very good friend of mine. Having established your credentials, I want to ask two questions.
What about Bob Hawke next to Dave?
Hey,
Bob.
So, Peter, after you spoke, Danby spoke about the possibility of a successful attack of Taiwan. I want to ask two questions. This is the first of them. There is no chance of an unsuccessful attack, is there?
That's the first question. Well, there is. There's always a chance of an unsuccessful attack. I mean, if as Paul has been pointing out, we do put together a very strong defence deterrence if the aircraft carriers are there in presence, if Taiwanese defence forces are hardened, if there is a cyber and space push to like position ourselves with the PSYOPs, and all of these elements are coordinated by both the US and its allies. There is a possibility that there is one scenario that Xi may make an attempt and it is repelled. That's certainly a possibility.
Okay. The second question is, Xi has jailed many of his opponents for one reason or another. Is that strengthening his position, or is it a sign of weakness?
That's a good question, actually, because my own view on that is it provides a type of brittle strength. It's a strength that's on the surface. He looks very powerful. He looks very dominant. But the best way I can put it is, really good leaders need to, when they hold some sand in their hand, they have the balance just right. If you squeeze too much, the sand falls out of your hand. If your hand is too loose, the sand falls out of your hand. But to hold the maximum amount of sand and the balance in a country and your power and your leadership, you've just got to get that right. Now, he's squeezing really hard. And so my question is, and I don't know the answer, is he centralising and squeezing so hard that there are elements within the system that are going to respond, that are going to expose the brittleness of his authoritarian or autocratic control? I don't know the answer to that question, Alan. I'm also worried about it because there are elements now, such as the surveillance state, which gives him an ability to suppress, frankly, that kind of resistance. You know, he's taken out all of his internal enemies within the CCP. He's taken out, Bourgeois and all these other people. He's monitoring the population. I'm sure elements there are in the CCP who understand those economic arguments and so on. But are they making a move? Are they actually working on something? Unknown.
Alan, can I just ask Kimberly something about the American leadership? Kimberly, has Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, or Chuck Schumer said anything about Taiwan that would be encouraging? We're not going to have them sort of, prefer the Kabul option, are we?
Well, I'll go to Kamala Harris first. I hope President Biden remains in very good health. In terms of Nancy Pelosi, well, you and I both know that she actually led a delegation to Tibet, the last parliamentary delegation that was allowed in 2011. I hold
it's a
out
shame
some
because I was
hope.
going on the next one with her, but she was having her international comrades with her, but we never made it.
Yes, look, I think that, I think the midterms will be, they're very instructive. And I think then the next presidential elections, when I saw that former President Trump was applying to have his Twitter account freed, I think if he runs, there's a possibility he'll win the Republican nomination. And I think that, that changes the balance again. But we won't know that.
And DeSantis, Nikki Haley,
I really like
Secretary Pompeo, are they all solid on Taiwan?
Well, you know me, Michael, I'm always in favour of a good old-fashioned Republican. So, I think that there are some the point is that both sides of the aisle in America have united on China. And I think there's it doesn't matter which state you're from, who's supporting you to get there. There is a universally held view. Maybe there's different emphases, but I think the American representative system is very good on this and will be. There is a reason that when we see people protesting in the streets of Hong Kong and Cuba more recently, that they're wearing T-shirts with the stars and stripes, because America represents freedom. And I think the American people are very aware of that.
Okay, Alan, sorry, over to you. I think probably have to be the last one, hey?
Yeah, last question, Danby, and it's to Kimberley. Kimberley, he's one of yours, Bob Carr, longest-serving New South Wales Premier, esteemed member of the Australian community, very well educated, very well read. He's been a mate of mine for a long time. But when it comes to China and Israel, why is he so wrong?
Alan, from your lips to God's ears. His views are very disturbing. And I'll say this, and Peter's here as a Victorian as well, is that in New South Wales, in both sides of politics, there is a lot of unsoundness, and particularly on China. I spoke about Israel in my first speech. I think Israel is a beacon of democracy and light in a region without a lot of either of those things. It's a great country. And, I think there's a lot we can learn from Israel. And I was thinking about this recently, just, because we had been with Albert to visit startup technologies. And I think that was, it's been very instructive. On China, I hate to say to be perhaps so prosaic, but I think Bob Carr's received a lot of money.
I'm all good, Danby.
And I'm also very mindful. I can hear my mother in my ears saying, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all.
And can I say something nice about John Fitzgerald? Because that article that you wrote about Bob Carr in the Financial Review, I'm sorry it's in the Financial Review, Alan, but it is the be and end all of anything anyone ever needs to know about Bob Carr. It's magisterial, I would put it as good as that. So if anyone, our listener who hasn't read it, wants to read something definitive on Bob Carr, go to the Financial Review centre pages some years ago. It's on my Facebook site, just so I can remind people. I once posted it out and it got 30,000 hits. So that was, Bob Carr's not popular.
That's great.
Alan, do you want me to wind it up now?
Yes, mate.
Okay, look, I'm sorry Alex Downer wasn't with us. I think he would have added something to this, and he was very enthusiastic about participating. But really, I think the four of you have shown the depth of knowledge that you have on this topic. And I think Beijing's been a little surprised at the reaction of Australian policymakers, both the academic and political level. Armitage, the former American Assistant Secretary of State, made a comment on this, that they've misread Australians and they've misread you. And thought leadership on this issue is very important, because the Australian people are looking for that leadership and looking for that knowledge. And it's not just me and Alan Howe and Albert Dadon who appreciate it. It's the 80% of Australian people who Peter, the Lowy poll showed are more critical of Australia. That's not something racist, as John Fitzgerald's been very firm about, and I agree with his firmness. It's critical of the Chinese government. It's not something that Australians have initiated. We had such a benign view of them in 2014-15 that we were actually shocked at their behaviour. So thank you, all of you, for not just tonight, but for all of the leadership and knowledge that you give people out there who